the internet turned vulnerability into aesthetic. There was a time when vulnerability was something private. It lived in silence, in letters never sent, in conversations behind closed doors, in moments that were felt but not performed. It wasn't meant to be seen, it was meant to be survived. But the internet changed the condition of being seen. Now vulnerability doesn't just exist. It circulates. It appears in images, captions, short videos, quotes over rain-soaked windows, shaky selfies, and carefully unfiltered confessions. Pain has become visible, and in becoming visible, it has also become stylized. We don't just express vulnerability anymore, we frame it. Soft lighting, muted tones, broken captions, minimalist fonts over emotional statements. Even silence has a visual language now. Even breakdowns have aesthetics. And somewhere along the way, vulnerability stopped being only an experience and started becoming a form of content. This is not a simple loss. It is more complicated than that. Because on one hand, the internet gave people language for feelings they were never allowed to express before. It created space for honesty, for recognition, for saying, "Me too," across distance and difference. But at the same time, it also transformed that honesty into something that must be seen to matter. And once something must be seen, it begins to change shape. A private emotion is messy, inconsistent, often unphotogenic. But a public emotion must be readable. It must be compressed into something understandable in seconds. It must fit into a post, a story, a clip. So vulnerability becomes curated. A heartbreak is not just felt, it is documented. A moment of sadness is not just lived, it is posted with a caption that makes it legible. Even healing becomes a narrative arc, edited for visibility. And slowly, we begin to learn how vulnerability should look. We start recognizing certain visual patterns as authentic: the blurred selfie, the empty room, the rainy street, the late-night confession text. These become signals, codes for emotional truth. But here is the tension. The more recognizable vulnerability becomes, the more it risks becoming performative. Not fake, but shaped. Not dishonest, but filtered through awareness of how it will be seen. Because the moment you know you are being seen, you begin to edit yourself. Even in your honesty, the internet does not necessarily create false emotions. But it changes their presentation. It turns inner life into something partially externalized, something that can be arranged, shared, and circulated. And once vulnerability enters circulation, it starts to behave like an aesthetic category. Something that can be liked, shared, saved, reposted, something that can be consumed. This creates a strange contradiction. We crave realness more than ever. We are drawn to raw content, unfiltered moments, honest storytelling. But the demand for authenticity often produces its own aesthetic, an aesthetic of authenticity. And so vulnerability becomes both sincere and staged at the same time. A tear is still a tear, but now it also carries composition, timing, framing, potential engagement. Even silence is no longer just silence. It becomes a visual statement. The deeper irony is that this does not make vulnerability less real. It makes it more complicated. Because people are still genuinely hurting, genuinely healing, genuinely expressing themselves. But their expressions now pass through a system that shapes how they are seen, and sometimes how they are understood. So the question is not whether vulnerability on the internet is real or fake. The question is what happens to vulnerability when it becomes visible to everyone. When it becomes something we look at, instead of something we simply hold. Because once vulnerability becomes aesthetic, it starts to belong to an audience as much as it belongs to the person feeling it. And in that shared space, something delicate happens. We begin to learn how to feel in ways that can be seen. And perhaps, the most modern form of vulnerability is not hiding our pain, but learning how to make it visible without losing it entirely in the process.